That's it. All right, so check on Google Classroom. The notes should be up there for chapter 4. Yeah, you're there. So I'm going to move on to chapter 4. I'll promise I'll get the test scores in if you guys didn't. If you guys turned the test in over the weekend. So I'll get that checked out. So we're going to move a little bit west here, right? We're going to head to Greece. And so yesterday I sent out a video to kind of introduce that section there. I didn't get a chance to grade that, but anybody watch that video? Good job. All right. If you haven't watched it yet, I highly recommend you watch it so you can get those points there for that. All you got to do is like watch it and follow along. It'll take it's less than an hour. So
it's 50 minutes.
Yeah, it's like 50 minutes. It's not bad. All right. So what I want to do here is like with a lot of these early civilizations, we talk about geography as kind of the beginning of the kind of the story here. So like a lot of the early civilizations we talked about in chapter 2 and 3, right? We're mainly talking about how like a lot of these civilizations, these cultural hearths, begin around river systems here. All right. For the Greeks, it's water, right? But it's a little bit different. All right. There's a question on the test around what sea does the Greek civilization develop around? That would be the Aegean Sea. All right. And so in a sense here, this is like kind of the sea here plays an important role in the kind of the economy. It plays an important role in kind of how the Greeks kind of see themselves, if you will. And so when we talk about Greece as a kind of like, today there's a modern country of Greece, right? There was not necessarily a kind of concept of a Greek kind of central state, centralized government, if you will. It was mainly made up of various kind of cultures and stuff like that that shared certain things like, language, religion, stuff like that. All right. Generally, what they did was in early history, they tended to break the Greeks into kind of 4 like kind of classifications of like kind of collection of clans. You have the Achaeans, the Aeolians, the Ionians, and the Dorians. All right, and they're basically location in general, kind of like their dialects tended to be different, but they shared certain traits there. All right, so when we talk about ancient Greece, we're not just talking about what we refer to as Greek proper here, which is the kind of Greek country, but also extending to the islands within the Aegean, stretching from Crete all the way up here, and then even what is now modern-day Turkey. All right. Often they refer to Greece, and still to this day referred to as Hellenes. All right. And so Greek as itself, as the term Greek, is a little bit more kind of English way to kind of describe this area here. So yesterday, like I said, the video mainly talked about 2 civilizations. Right, the first civilization that develops around the Aegean, which we would classify as not just the first Greek civilization, but you can argue the first civilization in Europe, is a civilization that was coined by a guy named Sir Arthur Evans as the Minoan civilization. All right, the main kind of center of the Minoan civilization is on the island of Crete, which is the largest island in the Aegean. It's in the southern Aegean, kind of butting up against the Mediterranean Sea. Now, this was named after this kind of mythological king, semi-mythological historical king by the name of Minos. Minos is like those figures we talked about, like Gilgamesh in Sumer or Menes in Egypt. There's maybe some evidence of a historical figure, but a lot of the stories are based on myth and legend. Like the video yesterday, King Minos was famous for having within his labyrinth, which was this kind of maze system underneath his main palace in the city of Knossos right here, this Minotaur. Right? Remember, the Minotaur was half man, half bull figure. And that story is related to mythology, right? Like in the story, King Minos's wife fell in love with a bull, this majestic bull that Minos was supposed to sacrifice to Poseidon, right? But he didn't. So we'll talk about mythology in more detail next week. You have to basically suspend disbelief to a certain extent. All right. And so as a result of this kind of like half man, half bull, he kept it in this labyrinth, and apparently received tribute from other parts of Greece, and that tribute was usually in the form of young men and women. All right. And in the story, there was a hero by the name of Theseus who slays the Minotaur. There's a story related how the Aegean Sea was named after Theseus, with the help of Minos's daughter. She gave him a string, yarn, who's able to make his way out of the labyrinth there. When his father's name was Aegeus. And so Aegeus told him before he sent him to Crete that if he slays the Minotaur, all right, that when his ship returns, he needs to put up a white sail. In the story, Theseus forgets to do that. It still has the black sail up. Aegeus sees that his son, as he looks out at his son, it looks like he's not returning alive, and he basically jumps into the sea that bears his name now, the Aegean Sea. Again, is that true? Oh, probably not. All right, but it's a great story, right? And so Evans gives this name and kind of creates a kind of a legend and stuff kind of associated with this. All right. So we're not totally sure what they refer to themselves. There is an evidence of the first Greek written language, which they refer to as Linear A. All right, which is a kind of a different kind of like kind of script and that. So Evans excavated Knossos and a couple other sites. Knossos is the most famous one, and so he kind of also like kind of repainted and kind of created bright colors, which they still kind of do today. It's a little bit of kind of controversy with that. All right, Mr. Shusky and I in 2007 took students to Greece there. And so there's a picture of him in front of the famous kind of structure that's associated with the palace. That's me in turn. Now this I'll show periodically in places that if we talk about world history that I've been fortunate enough to go to. This will be the only picture you'll see me smiling because I try to keep it mean mugging because I don't know who's going to come at me while I'm on vacation. Like can't trust other tourists. All right. And again, this is kind of repainted, if you will. There is this famous fresco in the video. I talked about it yesterday of this bull fresco here, where apparently there was a ceremony in which young men and women would dance and jump around a bull. That's maybe where kind of like the story of the kind of the Minotaur and stuff maybe kind of overlap, if you will. And then they had this kind of like they put up this kind of stone structure that's supposed to represent the horns of that's me trying to emulate that, right? So that's, again, I showed this picture to one class and the girl just rolled her eyes at me. So I'm going to get away from that picture. All right. This is a kind of recreation of what they believe that the kind of palace complex looked like. The kind of picture where Shusky was in front of is right here, all right? And so there was a courtyard in front of there. They would have probably that ceremony where they have the jumping of the bull and such. There's hundreds of rooms, if you will. Evans also excavated a number of other sites, and like the video said yesterday, none of these places had walls around them. So he came up with a theory that as a result that they were a peaceful people, right? And then that in lies that whole legend, which was at basically the kind of the foundation of the video yesterday, the whole story of Atlantis. All right, there was this kind of area around. There's an island called Santorini today. But they believe that there was a site of a major volcanic eruption there that basically an entire kind of civilization kind of fell into the sea. Plato would tell the story and stuff like that. And periodically you would find these stories of where Atlantis was in various locations. In a sense here, this kind of creates this legend that the Minoans were kind of probably, that was the one thing that kind of led to their downfall, was probably the kind of seismic activity. Rather than being completely peaceful, that may be debatable because if you kind of adhere to the story of King Minos, that doesn't sound like a very peaceful king here, advocating that people send him like young men and women to be sacrificed to this half man, half bull creature that his wife had an affair with. So it's like seems a little strange, right? But that's a theory that Evans kind of came up with. In reality, what happens is this kind of the weakening of these kind of communities on Crete coincided also with the invasion from the mainland, and that was led by the other civilization that was mentioned in the video. That was the Mycenaeans. Right, the Mycenaeans are on essentially kind of what they call the Peloponnesus. If you had to classify them in the early classification of the Greeks, they would probably be the Achaeans. All right. Now, this was named after the fact that the kind of main city in settlement was the kind of the city of Mycenae. Another kind of archaeologist, which was mentioned in the video yesterday, kind of excavated Mycenae, a guy named Heinrich Schliemann, who wasn't really an archaeologist by trade. He basically kind of made his kind of wealth in California during the gold rush and was just fascinated with Greek history. All right. And so he went there and also uncovered the remains of kind of the event that's mostly associated with the Mycenaeans, the Trojan War, over in what is now modern day Turkey. All right. So this is, again, Schliemann would use kind of literature, right, Homeric literature and poems and stuff like that to try to trace the steps of this kind of culture and civilization. All right. Like the Minoans, this was a Bronze Age culture. They had their own kind of script as well called Linear B. All right. And so the kind of the entrance, this is like Schliemann uncovered basically the citadel there, the entrance into Mycenae with the lion's gates at the top there. This is what it looks like kind of from an aerial view. Compared to a lot of these other civilizations that we talked about, the Egyptians, Babylonians, Assyrians, stuff like that, the Greeks are relatively small in population. All right, the Greeks are kind of like, in reality, when you think about it, are kind of kicking past their coverage, so to speak. All right, they're going to do a lot of these great things with a relatively small kind of population compared to that kind of all these great civilizations. Also, these Mycenaean kings, and they still have some of these around, would be buried in these tombs called tholoses. All right, and a tholos was essentially a tomb that was built into the side of a mountain or like kind of a hillside, and then they would enclose it with bricks and stones and stuff like that, where the Mycenaean king would be buried and laid out there. All right. This is where kind of one of the places where in the video they're talking about Schliemann found kind of a mask, a funerary mask, where they thought it was King Agamemnon, who was the king that led the Greek contingency into the Trojan War, but it probably wasn't. All right. But those are still around. All right. And then the story of the Trojan horse and stuff like that. That's probably the most famous story with the Trojan War, which it was essentially the Greeks tricking the Trojans to bring in this wooden horse that they thought was an offering to Poseidon. But in reality, there was Greeks hiding in there, and then when they came out, they basically burnt the city to the ground. Schliemann did find evidence of a kind of a settlement that it looked like a massive kind of fire that kind of brought the settlement down. So there's some truth to what kind of Schliemann had found using kind of Homeric poems and stuff like that. However, the Mycenaeans, soon after what they believe, probably around 1000, so 1100 maybe, we see the Mycenaean kind of lose their, not their necessarily control, but their influence here in Greece, because we don't have usually one kind of like central power in the area. However, this also coincides with the downfall of a civilization we talked about in chapter 2, which was the Hittites, right? And the Hittites were the ones who kind of first melted and kind of worked with iron. I was talking about a people called the Sea Peoples, that there was Egyptian chroniclers gave them the name because they came from the sea and they just raided and pillaged. They're all over the Eastern Mediterranean. That roughly coincides with the end of the Mycenaeans' kind of dominance in Greece. So a lot of people now believe that the Sea Peoples were probably the displaced Greeks that just basically ran around the area just raiding and pillaging, and that. It was during this period where we see kind of the Dorians kind of develop as kind of the more dominant kind of Greeks. Probably the most famous group of Dorians, descendants of Dorians, would be the Spartans, who we'll talk about a little bit more detail on Thursday. All right. Now, they refer to this, historians do, as a Greek period of Greek Dark Ages because they believe we see a decline in kind of the linear B writing. You see less writing here. There may have been a kind of a decline in population due to probably internal warfare and such. Maybe even a lack of food production, particularly when it comes to cereal grains like wheat, but also things like olives, which were an important part to kind of the Greek diet and still is today. But it was during the tail end of this that two things are introduced to Greek that are kind of important. One is iron, the introduction of iron. This is probably to the fact that they're kind of close proximity to the to the Hittites, ushering in from the Bronze into the Iron Age. And then the alphabet towards the tail end. Now, some historians believe it's not really until the next period, what they call the Archaic period, where the alphabet was kind of more commonly used. But where does the alphabet come from? What civilization developed the alphabet? They squeezed a bunch of snails. Phoenicians, yeah. So the Phoenicians probably came in contact with the Greeks. Later, the Greeks come in contact with the Etruscans on the Italian peninsula, who come in contact with the Romans, and that's how we get that. All right. So there's some, your textbook says it was during this period that the alphabet was introduced. Some other historians claim maybe more to the next era, but we'll keep it here, the Archaic period. So it's not completely, we talk about a dark age, it's not completely kind of like without some kind of accomplishments here. All right. But it was also during the tail end here, we also see the development of kind of Greek literature and the idea of kind of Western literature really kind of developing. This is believed during the era of the time that the poet Homer, who was a bard. Bards were these guys that would wander around and basically kind of recite poetry and stuff like that. Homer's probably the most famous of the Greek bards. There's some theory that Homer may not even, in the one story, he's a blind poet and go around telling these stories dating back to the Mycenaeans and stuff like that. It was one story that he's actually a composite character of a number of people, or it was a woman even. All right, but what we do know that kind of associated with Homer, whoever it was this idea of epics. All right, and we talked about like the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Greeks don't create this, but in the Western perspective, they kind of give us that tradition. All right, so when we talk about poems, it's not necessarily that they rhyme, but they're just kind of written in kind of a stanza form, if you will. All right, and so what Homer is advocating is this kind of the quintessential, like what if you guys take mythology, Mr. Whitewood, a guy named Joseph Campbell will refer to as the hero's journey, if you will. All right, and so this is maybe Homer. We're not totally sure what he looks like per se. All right, there's a number of statues have been kind of like sculpted in his image, but we're not totally sure if that's him. All right, the two famous epics that are associated with Homer. One is the Iliad, all right, named after which was the Greek name for Troy, Ilium. All right, this takes place outside the walls of Troy. According to the legend, the Trojan War was a 10-year war. This takes place during the last, I think, like week of the Trojan War. All right. And so it uses the Trojan War. Homer uses the Trojan War as a backdrop, but the real focus is on individual kind of relationships and characters. All right. So you have on the side of the Greeks, you have people like Agamemnon, who was the king of Mycenae, who was the one who was leading the invasion on Troy. He brings in his brother Menelaus, who really gets it started. Menelaus is the king of Sparta, who his wife Helen basically ran off or was kidnapped, depending on what you believe, by the Trojan prince Paris. He's got a brother Hector, who's the greatest warrior amongst them. The king of Troy is Priam, and then you have priestesses and stuff. And then the gods and goddesses play a role in here. All right, they interact with the characters. Like the first scene in the Iliad, what they call the Wrath of Achilles, in which Achilles is slighted by Agamemnon. Agamemnon takes his prize priestess that he acquired in the battle. And Achilles is about ready to strike him when the goddess Athena swoops down and basically stops him from doing it. The gods and goddesses pick sides, all right? Like Aphrodite comes in and swoops down and saves Paris. And then there's the individual battles that go on, like the individual battle between Achilles and Hector, which actually was started when Achilles, who kept his men, the Myrmidons, out of the battle, initially, his shield bearer, a guy named Patroclus, basically put on his armor, looked like him, and Hector ended up killing him, thinking it was Achilles. And then Achilles, basically gets back at Hector by engaging in this battle with him right outside the walls of Troy. After he kills Hector, he drags his body out of a chariot, which for the Greeks that was insulting to do. The end of the Iliad is when Priam comes to the Greek camp and basically convinces Achilles to basically send his son back with him so he can have a funeral. So the end of the Iliad occurs at the funeral of Hector. All right. However, there's later legends that are kind of related, like in the story of Achilles, the death of Achilles. All right. Famously, Achilles is shot in that kind of the ankle there, where we get the Achilles tendon. I don't know if you've ever heard that, like maybe you know, what the hell is that all about? All right. In the story of Achilles, his mother was a sea nymph, a goddess. She tried to protect him by dipping him in the river Styx, which he would basically, when you dip him in there, you got to hold him by the ankles, I guess, when you dip him in the river. That was the only spot there he was basically kind of open to kind of injury. And Paris, in a later legend, Paris shoots him with an arrow, which Paris was always known for. And to the Greeks, that was kind of a cowardly way to take on somebody. There was a big emphasis on hand-to-hand combat and stuff. Have you ever seen the movie Troy? You guys ever seen that? That's been out. I normally would show that, at this period to give people a break from my incessant lecturing. But because of Rona, we can't really do that. And I think somebody said you guys did the English classes would show that. So yeah. I'll stop showing that as well. We were supposed to stop showing movies this year, so I won't show that. But if you ever turn on USA Network, it's on every 2 weeks, it seems like. All right. That's loosely based on the Iliad, super loosely based on it. In the movie, Patroclus is Achilles' cousin. In real life, they were kind of good friends. Wink. All right. And so the death of Achilles is played out later in another legend. All right. And then the other famous one is, that's associated to Homer is the Epic of the Odyssey. All right. And that's where we get the term on the Odyssey is basically, this is the quintessential travel journey. This is maybe closer maybe to the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? So this is the main character in the Odyssey is Odysseus, who the Romans later will refer to as Ulysses, right? Odysseus is the king of Ithaca, and he was the one who came up with the Trojan horse, right? And so this takes place 10 years, right? This is a 10-year journey where he's trying to get back to his wife Penelope back in Ithaca. The problem is that he pisses off Poseidon, who happens to be the god of the sea. If you're traveling by sea and you piss off Poseidon, you're probably going to have a long journey. All right. And so my son used to read the Percy Jackson books. I don't know if you guys were kind of read those. I think there was one movie we watched that was almost verbatim to the Odyssey to a certain extent. I know they went into it was a club, and that's where the Lotus Eaters were, and they kind kind of like lost, and there's like Oh Brother Where Art Thou was another movie that was like with George Clooney and stuff. It takes place during the 30s, during the Depression, but the Coen brothers who directed it have a whole bunch of nods towards the Odyssey. Like you'll see in there, like in that, if you ever seen the movie, the guy who does the blind guy who does the radio station where they do the song, that's supposed to be Homer. All right, and then there's a scene in which there's John Goodman's character's got an eye patch on there. He's supposed to be Polyphemus, who's the Cyclops son of Poseidon, who Odysseus blinds and stuff like that. All right, so this is the kind of quintessential kind of hero's journey to a certain extent. But a lot of Greek heroes, they're flawed. They're not like perfect. Right, these are people that go through a series of kind of there's a little bit of arrogance to them. A little bit what the Greeks would refer to as hubris and such. All I'm going to do is I'm going to play this kind of video that talks about kind of the Odyssey and how some concept of the Odyssey play a part in kind of Greek society.
A close encounter with a man-eating giant, a sorceress who turns men into pigs, a long-lost king taking back his throne. On their own, any of these make great stories, but each is just one episode in the Odyssey, a 12,000-line poem spanning years of ancient Greek history, myth, and legend. How do we make sense of such a massive text that comes from and tells of a world so far away? The fact that we can read the Odyssey at all is pretty incredible, as it was composed before the Greek alphabet appeared in the 8th century BCE. It was made for listeners rather than readers, and was performed by oral poets called rhapsodes. Tradition identifies its author as a blind man named Homer, but no one definitively knows whether he was real or legendary. The earliest mentions of him occur centuries after his era, and the poems attributed to him seem to have been changed and rearranged many times by multiple authors before finally being written down in their current form. In fact, the word rhapsode means stitching together, as these poets combined existing stories, jokes, myths, and songs into a single narrative. To recite these massive epics live, rhapsodes employed a steady meter along with mnemonic devices like repetition of memorized passages or set pieces. These included descriptions of scenery and lists of characters, and helped the rhapsode keep their place in the narrative, just as the chorus or bridge of a song helps us to remember the next verses. Because most of the tales were familiar to the audience, it was common to hear the sections of the poem out of order. At some point, the order became set in stone, and the story was locked into place as the one we read today. But since the world has changed a bit in the last several thousand years, it helps to have some background before jumping in. The Odyssey itself is a sequel to Homer's other famous epic, the Iliad, which tells the story of the Trojan War. If there's one major theme uniting both poems, it's this: do not, under any circumstances, incur the wrath of the gods. The Greek pantheon is a dangerous mix of divine power and human insecurity, prone to jealousy and grudges of epic proportions. And many of the problems faced by humans in the poems are caused by their hubris, or excessive pride in believing themselves superior to the gods. The desire to please the gods was so great that the ancient Greeks traditionally welcomed all strangers into their homes with generosity, for fear that the strangers might be gods in disguise. This ancient code of hospitality was called xenia. It involved hosts providing their guests with safety, food, and comfort, and the guests returning the favor with courtesy and gifts if they had them. Xenia has a significant role in the Odyssey, where Odysseus in his wanderings is the perpetual guest, while in his absence, his clever wife Penelope plays nonstop host. The Odyssey recounts all of Odysseus's years of travel, but the narrative begins in medias res, in the middle of things. 10 years after the Trojan War, we find our hero trapped on an island, still far from his native Ithaca and the family he hasn't seen for 20 years. Because he's angered the sea god Poseidon by blinding his son, a Cyclops, Odysseus's passage home has been fraught with mishap after mishap. With trouble brewing at home and gods discussing his fate, Odysseus begins the account of those missing years to his hosts. One of the most fascinating things about the Odyssey is the gap between how little we know about its time period and the wealth of detail the text itself contains. Historians, linguists, and archaeologists have spent centuries searching for the ruins of Troy and identifying which islands Odysseus visited. Just like its hero, the 24-book epic has made its own long journey through centuries of myth and history to tell us its incredible story today.
And so, like I said, there's a number of kind of concepts that are kind of laid out in both Iliad and the Odyssey, hubris, fate. But one thing that's particularly kind of Greek is this idea of a rite, this concept where there's an emphasis on kind of individual honor and basically courage and such. Right. This is going to play a role in, like, this is what one of the factors that kind of leads the Greeks to do such great things with a relatively small population. Right. And so what this plays out is not just in things like epic poems or warfare and such, but also the Greeks developed our first concept of competitive sports. Right. And so the kind of first kind of competition that's associated with that would be the Olympics. And there was numerous other ones that were throughout Greece, but this is the oldest and the most famous one. And so this was basically held in Olympia, dedicated to the patron god of Olympia, the god Zeus, all right, who we'll talk about when we talk about kind of the mythology next week. Essentially, it was initially just a running race that kind of parlayed into kind of 5 events called the pentathlon, where you had a running race, kind of a sprint, which is called stadia, where we get the term stadium from. Then you had like a javelin throw. You had long jump where they would have weights in their hands. You would have a discus throw, and then the last event was kind of a Greco-Roman wrestling style, where you basically had wrestling. Eventually, all athletes, including coaches, had to participate in the nude. There was a famous story in which women were not allowed to participate because this is still pretty much of a boys' club, or be coaches. And the story was that one mom dressed as a man to try to basically kind of coach her son. And when he won the race, she jumped over a fence and it kind of exposed that she was not a man. And so after that, they had all competitors kind of performing in the nude. This was basically they had the Olympics all throughout, up through the Roman times. Like people like Nero, the Emperor Nero participated in a chariot race when they had chariot racing. However, he flipped over his chariot and didn't finish the race, but they still gave him the laurel wreath, which was what you got when you won, right? Because that's the equivalent of letting your boss win, particularly if your boss is volatile, like Nero was. It ended when the time Christianity became the dominant religion because of its association with pagan rituals. Because it wasn't just a sporting event, you would have like some sacrifices dedicated to Zeus. You would also have like the kind of like over here you have a theater. So you would have like a kind of like you would have like plays later, poetry kind of competitions and such. But this was the main temple dedicated to the god Zeus. This is all that's left of it today. In 1896, they basically the modern Olympics were revised. The first place that they had them was in Athens in Greece as a nod to that. And I think that they had them again in 2004. I think was the last time they had the Olympics in Greece. The idea also was that during times of warfare, all fighting would cease for that period, but that's more of a legend. During the Peloponnesian War, there was battles that were occurring at the time during the Olympics. But this was something that we kind of like still have today, and that has kind of origins here back in ancient Greece. So on Thursday, I'm going to talk about the next era after the Greek Dark Ages called the Archaic period, and where we see basically the rise of the two kind of dominant city-states of people most know about ancient Greece, which would be the Athenians and the Spartans. All right. All right. Did you get that, Colin?
Yep.
All right, good deal. Okay. I'll see you on Friday. Okay.